So, if you've watched this channel, you know I love to make charts about camera gear. So, I decided to make a big old chart comparing the S1R Mark II specs, on paper at least, I don't have one in my hands, to the other like flagship level cameras out available on the market right now. So, that means I compared the S1R II to the Canon R5 II, the Fuji X-H2 and the X-H2S where needed, the Nikon Z8, which is also kind of like comparing it to the Nikon Z9, the Sony A1 II, and the Sony A7R Mark V. Right out the jump here, I will say that I didn't get every single little feature in Lumix cameras. It has so many software features that I didn't want to list them all. I tried to list the ones that are most important to me to give you a flavor of what I'm talking about, but just know there's even more features in Lumix cameras that are on this chart. Some examples of those are waveform customizability, an insane level of button customizations, like literally any button in the camera, you hold it down, and then you can put all kinds of stuff behind that button press. You also have like options below the option to customize those button presses. So it's really impressive. There's a lot of customization. Also, single point metering for video is like so nice. I don't understand why other cameras don't have that. You move that little point around and you can meter that exact spot. It's so cool. I didn't put every single feature in this chart, just enough to give you a flavor for what I'm talking about. Maybe I should say I already overdid it and didn't want to make the chart 2 pages long. You know, you'll get the point as you look at this chart here. In the chart, green means best in class feature. Yellow means good feature, but kind of like middle of the pack. Many other cameras have it. And then red is, you messed up. That spec is worse than the others. So if you look at the Lumix S1R Mark II, it only has 2 red marks. The first one is probably pretty obvious to anyone who watches YouTube videos about camera gear, right? The S1R II doesn't have a stacked sensor. Now, the Nikon Z8 came out like 2 years ago, okay? In like mid 2023. So it's not like Panasonic didn't know what the Z8 could do. You know, if you watch my other video about rolling shutter performance, you'll see, in addition to the stuff in this chart where, we talk about that the Z8 has probably better dynamic range than the S1R, it wasn't like Panasonic was that surprised, okay? Like the Z8 has been out for almost 2 years. They could have seen this, looked at the spec chart, tried the camera out. So they know that the S1R, 2 has some deficiencies, is not as good as the Z8 in certain aspects, right? Again, I really would like to see more testing. The one video I've seen comparing them was not very informative. It was kind of more like a ramble in the snow, honestly, which I ramble a lot, don't get me wrong. But it wasn't really like as technical as I would have liked, especially on the image quality piece. But, that all is a rambly way of saying, I really do wish the S1R Mark II just had a stacked sensor in it. If nothing else, Lumix, kind of like Fuji recently, I think has seen Sony's success in the marketplace, especially with YouTubers and content creators, and kind of made these like Sony-esque cameras that are kind of generic like Sony cameras, Like, let's not forget the days of the Lumix GX8 and GX9, sweet little rangefinders with cool EVFs and flip-up screens. They were just missing joysticks and sensor protector covers, and they were basically perfect cameras. Like, we've gotten really far away with that with Lumix. Now we're just kind of making regular old, SLRs like the Canon R5, Z8, Sony A7R5, Sony A1 II, like you see in this chart, right? Fuji X-H2, which I think, Fuji, same thing, not that sexy of a camera, kind of a Sony, bite off. So if you're going to do that and you're just going to try to like compete with Sony, then in my mind, every single feature has to be better than the applicable Sony camera. Right? You can't, and we'll talk more about this, but you can't get stuck between 2 different Sony models, okay? That doesn't make sense. That's not going to make any Sony user, or Canon or Nikon user for that matter, switch to Panasonic, right? They're going to look at that and say, well, my brand has a stacked sensor kind of flagshipy camera, higher end camera. Why would I switch to a brand that like has less camera bodies, I'm not as familiar with, and then doesn't have a stacked sensor? To me, it's just like such an obvious miss in terms of marketing. I think there's way more people that will look at it like that than people that will go, oh, the Lumix is $100 cheaper than the Z8 on sale and is like, $500 or $600 cheaper than like the A7R5. I just don't think that difference is big enough that would make people switch, or even people looking to go into a system. I don't think that swing of like $100 or $600 would sway people one way or the other. You know, they're going to be looking at other things. If it was $1,000 different, maybe a different story. You know, I will also say, to Panasonic's credit, like they often like do bundles and give free lenses. Like I bought the S9 and it came with a lens, and then like I mistimed it, but I think if I had timed it right, I could have gotten that goofy 26 or 28 millimeter pancake and a 50 millimeter f1.8, which I did get and is coming in the mail. So that significantly reduces the cost, but you're getting basically 2 or 3 lenses for free with the camera. Then you start to look at it that like that. But just like body price for body price, I don't know that making the S1R Mark II $3,300 versus the Nikon Z8's current $3,400, the A7R5's $3,500, $200 difference. Like, I just don't know like that it's that compelling of a price difference. I think they would have been better off just going closer to $4,000, having the stack sensor, and then literally you've got so many other like internal software features that are better, that then it's a very compelling thing. It's like, hey, hardware wise, this is the same or better than the Z8, the R5 II, the A7R5, arguably the A1 Mark II, possibly. And then you get all these crazy video features, a high-res photo mode, all this stuff. That's where people go, oh, maybe it's time to look at L mount and switch to Lumix. Without that stack sensor, I don't know. I just don't know how compelling of a camera it is, at least for people looking to switch. I will say that, I do have a couple of like camera store anecdotes as data points, that do point to this camera selling well, I guess, to people that are already in the system or people just entering the full frame market, maybe leaving Fuji, for example. On that score, there is a pre-order list at one camera store here in town, and then another camera store, sort of the second camera store in town. We have the largest camera store in Texas. It's not that one, it's another one. They hadn't carried Lumix previously. They just ordered a whole bunch of L mount and Lumix stuff, and they're going to start carrying it at the end of the month in anticipation of the S1R Mark II being available at the end of the month. So April could be a very exciting time for Panasonic. But, again, I wish it had a stack sensor. I feel like we'd have even more news around that, if it had that stack sensor. It'd be like, oh, like all these people that switched from Lumix to Nikon, Big Cook, maybe looking at switching back because they want all those video features back, and like otherwise the cameras are exactly the same. I mean, maybe the Lumix is even a little bit better. So that's the one big missing feature. The other one is my little pet peeve, prayer to the camera gods, highlight blinkies. The only 2 camera manufacturers that put highlight blinkies in photo, so like when you have an overexposed part of the scene while you're looking in the EVF or on the back screen, it blinks. The highlight warning blinks. Fuji cameras do this. I love that. I do think Fuji's maybe have the best shooting experience for photo. And then Leica cameras have this, right? So it seems like Lumix could learn how to do this from Leica if it's that hard. Get the 4 lines of code to do this, But those are literally the only 2 things I see totally missing from the camera. In terms of yellow stuff that could be better, but like is sort of in the middle, on par with most of the cameras here. That 44 megapixel sensor. I have a whole other video about this, but I don't think this should have been the S1R. This should have been the S1, the true hybrid. And I think they should have made an S1R with that 61 megapixel sensor that's magic for photo, but trash for video. That seems more like an R resolution camera to me, but I digress. And then the dynamic range. This is something I really want to test. Even with the dynamic range boost on, it's like 14 stops. Now, I was very surprised to see that, the Nikon Z8 and the Sony A1 II, both stack sensor cameras, appear to have more dynamic range than the S1R, even with the dynamic range boost thing turned on. And then when turned off, it's got 13 stops, which is worse. The only camera that's worse than this is the Canon R5 Mark II, although like some places say 12 stops, CineD had like 13 or 14, so I'm not sure how true that is. But, certainly in terms of dynamic range, I'm not sure there was that much advantage, in going with a non-stack sensor. I do wonder if maybe it's better in low light than stack sensors. I don't know. I feel like the testing and the information on YouTube has been so spotty around this. So I'm really curious about that. And then also I want to mention this, and I think I mentioned this in another video or two, that like, if we're being honest though, None of these stack sensors are in cameras that Hollywood use, right? Whereas the sensor that's in the S1R II, that DJI 8K Ronin 8K sensor, that's been used to film a bunch of Hollywood movies. So, I do wonder if there's something there in terms of image quality and the way it retains color, or just, roll off, those kinds of things where, like the non-tech spec aspect of things, just like the image quality, the pleasingness, like where you get into Leica lenses and stuff, where you really have to know your stuff and really have seen a bunch of different lenses or a bunch of different cameras and sensors to understand those subtle differences that make the image quality better that you might not see on a spec sheet. So I do wonder about that. The S1R II is the only one that's got like a true cinema sensor in it. So that's kind of interesting. And then the other yellow thing here is that it looks like the S1R Mark II has 779 autofocus points. That is better than most, except for the Canon R5 II, which has 975 points. That was sort of surprising. Hypothetically, the R5 II should be positioned to have the best autofocus of the bunch. The S1R has more than Sony, way more than Nikon, way more than Fuji. So it's possible that Panasonic autofocus, especially in video, I think, will catch up to like Sony, maybe even surpass it. I still think, at least the last time I tried the Canon R5 II and the Nikon Z8, like their autofocus wasn't nearly as good as Sony. And I could see the S1R II actually leapfrogging them and being better, at least in video, and closer to Sony than Nikon and Canon. Photo autofocus is a different story. Like Canon, Nikon, Sony, they are all neck and neck, and Panasonic's a little bit worse. However, I could see with the S1R II, maybe they've caught up there too, where all of the brands are sort of just insane for photo and that's it. I feel like the real autofocus differences you see in video, and I think a lot of YouTubers honestly get this wrong, like Canon and Nikon's video autofocus is still lacking as compared to Sony and maybe Panasonic. And then finally, you'll see there's three categories here that I didn't fill in. I feel like you need to actually see a back screen and a viewfinder. Magnification and resolution to a certain extent don't really tell the whole story. I was glad to see that every camera except for the Nikon Z8 has my minimum like 5.7 or so dots for an EVF. I think anything below that and manual focusing gets hard because it's just not detailed enough of an image in the EVF. And then, the S1R II's 1.84 dot back screen is worse than the other ones, except for Fuji. But from everything I've seen, apparently people think it looks just like a 2.0 or 2.1 dot screen. So I'll have to see that and test that. But those are ones, along with that the viewfinder size, magnification size, I still want to test. Like another example of why I didn't grade this and put the, red, yellow, green thing in here is like the Sony says it has a 9.4 dot, but it like drops when you're shooting. And I just don't think the Sony EVFs look very good. You can't really see them. They're kind of really small. Whereas like the Nikon Z8, it's 3.69 dots. So it is not high enough resolution for certain manual focusing, but it seems bigger and brighter and the colors are nice. So it's actually kind of a pleasing viewfinder, but for the bad resolution. Canon R5 II, pretty good also. And then the Fuji X-H2 is kind of middle of the pack. I feel like it's fine. So maybe even better than the Sony. There's something about the Sony viewfinders I don't like. So again, I didn't grade that because I think that's something you really got to put your eye or your hands on, as it were. Since I don't have the S1R II in hand yet, I didn't want to get into that. Then I'm not going to go camera by camera. You can just hit pause and look at the chart here, But again, I'll just say like the big surprise for me was the dynamic range piece where Canon's stack sensor is seemingly worse than everybody else's, whereas like the Nikon and Sony stack sensors, which are I think both made by Sony, there doesn't seem to be much of a dynamic range hit at all, and in fact might be better than the non-stacked S1R II. So that's sort of an interesting thing that I noticed. Open gate is a big one. Fuji and Panasonic are the only ones that do it. I'm curious if it's a stack sensor thing. The Sony A7R5 also doesn't have it, but that's a really slow reading sensor. It'll be interesting to see if the SL3 gets open gate like the SL3S. That would answer that question. But yeah, so Panasonic is the only full frame manufacturer that does open gate. It's the only one that does anamorphic D-squeeze. Nikon just put it in, but otherwise Panasonic's the only camera manufacturer that's had shutter angle for a long time in its cameras. Panasonic just got false color. Canon R5 II has false color. The rest don't. That's kind of surprising. Continuous shooting, Panasonic has pre-shooting. It's got 40 frames per second, but the buffer sucks, which, I feel like if they come out with that stack sensor camera, they got to fix the buffer. But, just for frames per second, it's the best out of this group, surprisingly, even better than the A1 II. Another big one is 32-bit float audio. Only Panasonic has that. with the adapter on top of the camera. I think the other, really big thing here that I would point out is that all these cameras, except the Sony cameras, record RAW internally. So that's something that Sony really needs to fix to even to be competitive with Canon and Nikon. I will also say that, I didn't get too much into the app stuff, but like Canon and Nikon's apps aren't very good. Fuji's app is also pretty bad. The Sony app, especially the new one, the Creator Studio thing, is awesome, and it gives you a lot of these features that the Panasonic gives in the camera, like false color, like shutter angle, I believe, like anamorphic D-squeeze. So sort of an interesting implementation. I know that's true for the FX3. I'm not sure if it's true for all Sony cameras, but something to keep an eye on. And then of course, Lumix is killing the game with apps, like phone apps for the camera. You've got the Lumix Lab with all the LUT stuff. You've got the new one, the Flow, I think it's called, for storyboarding, and you can use your phone as a monitor. So that's really cool. That kind of also flows into like color profiles, right? Like, I think Panasonic now has the best customizability around color profiles, right? You can put literally any LUT, and you can stack LUTs for both photo and video. So you can make the camera look like anything, like a Fuji, like a Sony, like a Canon, whatever you want. That's awesome. I feel like they've actually leapfrogged Fuji, where like film simulations now seem almost like last generation, you can make film recipes and stuff, but like LUTs are totally customizable, and you can do it in so many different softwares. So that's really impressive. Something that people don't know is that you can do this with Sony cameras too. You totally can. I don't know if you can get like grain, but you can do a lot of things with Sony cameras. People don't talk about that. I know Cam Mackey talks about you can kind of do it with Nikons, but it's not great. So there is some custom profile stuff there. Canon, I don't think you can really do it. Second to last thing I'll talk about is lens selection. I feel like L-mount is caught up. There's a lot of really exciting lenses available for the L-mount. Sony is still probably the best, but L-mount's coming up. Nikon has somewhat opened their mount. It's kind of like Fuji has somewhat opened their mount. Maybe Fuji's a little bit better, but not nearly the level of Sony and the L-mount with all of its different manufacturers. And then Canon, of course, is the worst. They haven't really opened up their mount to third-party manufacturers, so you basically have to buy Canon lenses if you're using the R5 II. And then lastly, I'll just talk about the most subjective category. This is just for me, colors. Color science, as it were. Color science. I just really like Panasonic colors. I have been surprised at the color fidelity of their cameras. Like, it's true to life. Better than most other brands. I would say at least better than all the brands in this list. Canon's colors are probably second, in the list for me. Fuji has interesting colors, but it's often not accurate. It's more like artsy, retro, kind of pastel-y, washed out, film looking. So for like commercial work, that's not good. You can totally get those looks in post, so I'd rather have a clean, color-accurate rendition out of the camera, and then they can make it look vibey in post. I prefer that much more. I've said this in many other videos. No one's refuted me, so I think people agree, but maybe not vociferously, But in my opinion, Nikon colors, great for objects, great for wildlife, not so great for portraits and humans. The skin tones are weird in Nikon. And then Sony, the colors have gotten better, but they're still the worst of this pack. They're just not that great. There's a bunch of people, like, I think it's like EOS HD, that make things to fix Sony colors, right? Or like Phantom LUTs for video. There's so many products fixing Sony colors. I think that's all you need to know about that. Again, you can always change all this in post to fix the colors, but I just prefer a good color accurate starting point. It makes life easier. And for me, at least, the Lumix Panasonic cameras have the best, except maybe Leica. More to come on that in another video. Just if you count out the greens, yellows, and reds, Panasonic had 14 greens, 3 yellows, 2 reds. That was the best of the group. Canon had 5 greens, 3 yellows, 11 reds. Fuji had 7 greens, 3 yellows, and 10 reds. Nikon had 3 greens, 6 yellows, 11 reds. Sony A1 had 5 greens, 4 yellows, and 10 reds. Sony R5 had 4 greens, 3 yellows, and 12 reds. So I think this A shows my preferences, but B, just to give the ranking, that puts Panasonic in first, Fuji in second, and then Sony and Canon tied for third, and Nikon last. But, one, I would say that like Nikon could jump way up. If they just added all the video features that the Panasonic has, they would be, probably number 2, Kind of the same thing with Sony, although like I feel like Sony, there's just things I don't like about the Sony. Same could be said of Fujifilm, but they have fixed their video autofocus and get all these video features. That would be really compelling, even though it's APS-C, so sort of like 2 takeaways here, I think. One is that like Panasonic's winning this chart just because of all the internal video features. Most of these manufacturers should have the resources to put all this stuff into their software. If they do, Panasonic loses this advantage and becomes like bottom of the pack, right? And then you're really wishing this thing had a stack sensor. I just don't understand why they didn't do that, you know? Like, yes, the S1R has some other hardware features, like sort of like the locking switch for certain buttons, the tally lights on the front and the back. It's got the rad 5-way in, out, up, down screen like the Sony cameras now. But again, like without that stack sensor, hardware wise, it's behind the Nikon, it's behind the Canon, you know? Like all the cameras have pre-shooting. As I understand it, Canon's is worse because you can't program how long, or it's a half second or a second long the pre-shooting goes for. But the S1R2's got it. The Z8's got it. Like I said, the Canon R5's got it. Sony's had it for a long time. You know, the Fuji's got it. I think maybe Fuji's had it the longest. People don't even realize it. They've had it since like the X-T2, I think. So you know, some of these features are just the same across the board. So ultimately, what does this mean? I think it means that, eventually, especially if the other camera companies don't catch up with Lumix in terms of the video features and software, it's going to come down to intangibles for someone entering the full frame market and buying the system of their choice. Is the camera fun, easy to use? Is it snappy operation? Like, is there not a delay when you turn on the camera? How does the button layout look, feel, and operate, right? Like, one of the reasons I love the Lumix cameras is like, you have an ISO button you push to change the ISO, right? You have a white balance button to push to change the white balance. That makes so much sense to me. And then other things like, how comfy is the grip? Does the grip fit your hand well? Do the files coming out of the camera, are they easy to use? Are they easy to edit? Do they look nice? Those little things may be the deciding factor when all these cameras are kind of starting to look the same. So yeah, I like to make these charts. I just like to see these things. I like to visualize them. I'm a visual person. I'm a photographer. It shouldn't be that surprising. But, I make these charts just to inform myself. But I have to say that I don't think that, this chart, the information, it really changed anything for me. I'm still going to go out and get an S1R II. I think for me, it's probably the best fit for a full frame camera. But again, it comes down to intangibles. So if I hate the way it feels, kind of like I did with Sony cameras, it might not be. We'll see. But I thought it was an interesting enough exercise to share with you, and kind of also try to get a conversation started. Have I missed anything? Like, are there other categories I should have included there, like crucial categories that people will take into account when making a camera purchase decision? Did I overweight all the software video features that Lumix cameras have that the other ones don't? For the most part, like for example, Fuji has OpenGate. And then, yeah, speaking of Fuji, the GFX 100 RF or whatever, like the rangefinder X106 thing is going to be announced like tomorrow. That's pretty exciting. That might be pretty close to a perfect camera. So, how does that change the landscape? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.